but just make sure everything's good. Yep, we're rolling. Alright, let's get to it then, shall we? Let's get to it.
It gives me great pleasure in introducing our esteemed superintendent of this audience, who will lead the rebel yell. I'll yell myself presently. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel highly honored at the introduction of our worthy friend and comrade Captain Dr. Lewis. And I will do the best I know how to get that yell up for you. What few of us old corn-feds are left, we'll do all we can. We can't give you much, but we'll give you what we got left. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of announcing to you that we are going to make an effort to repeat the old rebel yell. 1, 2, 3.
Charge 'em, boys! Charge 'em!
We'll now give you the individual there, Captain James Dinkin. General Stevens. Colonel Pierce. Jones. Colonel Jones, I beg pardon. Yes, all right. No, go on. Good boys! All thou vessels. Yeah. Yes, sir. All right, yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Paris Legrand. All it out. All right. J.W. Mellon. One more. James Blunt. Mr. Powell. Holland. Go ahead. Holland. One more. All right. Go put your dress on now. General Pierce. Right. Go for him, boys. Hey, get on the hill, boys. Get on the hill. Get on the hill, boys.
November 6, 1860, Lincoln is elected President of the United States with less than 50% of the vote. It's like 40%. That happened while there are a bunch of other guys running too, so Lincoln's not even the first choice. But a month later, December 20th, South Carolina, and here what they claim are their states' rights, and there's a whole conversation to be had about what exactly that means. But they decide the federal government's not serving their needs, and they're out of there. So they're going to secede from the Union. Over the next 4 months, another 9 states or so are also going to leave. Basically, the entire Deep South, right along the coastline, are all going to say, I'm out of here. We're done. We're not going to be part of the Union anymore. Then you get to mid-April, 12th. Confederate forces in the harbor of Charleston are going to open fire on the federally held Fort Sumter. right there in the middle of the harbor. It's little floating fortress, right? In the Civil War begins. First shots were fired at that time. Interestingly, one of the bloodiest conflict in American history begins without a single in-battle casualty. When a cannon blows up and injures somebody, otherwise nobody dies during this. Of course, that's going to change very rapidly. But the war has begun. A few days later, Lincoln calls for aid. He says, I need soldiers to fight in this war. This is clearly going to take some effort. We're going to bring the South back into the Union. These are rebellious states. We're going to bring them back. So he calls up for aid. He calls up for 90,000 troops to serve for 3 months. Now that does not sound like enough men or enough time. That isn't, but that's literally all that he can call up. He can call up 90,000 men for 3 months because almost our entire military at that time are militia. There's state militia. There's like a standing army of like 10,000 people. It's very small, and a lot are going to lose and join the Confederacy. So Lincoln says, we need militias to come up and serve and fight in this army. So he calls for aid, and as soon as he does that, 4 more states, Virginia among them, say, I'm not going to fight against my southern brother. We didn't want to leave, but now you're forced to. They're also going to go. So Lincoln's kind of concerned at this point. As you might understand, he's asking for help, and states are still leaving the Union entirely. So fortunately for him, thank you, Michigan is going to answer the call. The rest of the northern states that remain will, of course, do so also, but Michigan is actually one of the first states to send troops. He's going to call up 4 regiments of infantry to serve from Michigan. Michigan says, oh, we can do better than that. They sent 7. So Michigan is a new state at this time. We joined the Union in 1837, so there are people who still remember before Michigan was, a state. They're pretty proud of this new country they're a part of, so there's a really good response. So May 15th, 1st Michigan Volunteer Infantry march into Washington. And Lincoln says to one of the aides standing nearby, he goes, what number are those? He says, the little boys are from Michigan, sir. He basically says, thank God for Michigan. He didn't know if anyone was going to be sending help. Michigan did, that was good for us. Over the course of the war, Michigan is actually going to send about 90,000 men, which is about a quarter of the male population. A lot of other states sent more, but we sent one of the largest proportionately. About 14,000 men are not female, which is, again, one of the higher rates of casualties, unfortunately. Now, that all being said, nobody knew that at the time. So, a bunch of bright-eyed young farm boys say, hey, this sounds like fun. I'm going to go join the Army. And you think about it, most of these guys have never been away from home hardly most of their life. You've got, you're going to be born, live, get married, raise your kids, and die within a 20-mile radius, unless you're going to end up moving to a different state, which did happen a fair bit coming to Michigan. So these guys think, well, this is great. I'm going to get to go and see the world a little bit, to travel the country, get a snazzy uniform, get great meals in the Army. Everyone knows there's good food in the Army, right? They didn't learn yet. Uniform looking good. This is going to be a fun time. And the war's going to be over by Christmas, right? He's asking for about 3 months. It's nothing. They can do that. So they start signing up.
Reload! Aim! Fire! Left wheel! March! Forward!
Move it on, you rebel devil.
Just the plain blue sack coats that both the infantry and the cavalry used, those are basically the fatigue blouses. Just normal, everyday fatigue wear.
Break ranks, march!
Huzzah! Leap to the rear. Leap to the rear. Lunge.
So then the other round that was shot through this was the canister round. And if you can understand, get a concept of this, it was 148 69 caliber lead balls.
Today we did a 17-mile forced march representing A.P. Hill's Confederate Division that came from Harper's Ferry, Virginia to Miller's Cornfield here at the Antietam Battlefield to save the Army of Northern Virginia from defeat. They were in Harper's Ferry accepting the surrender of almost 20,000 federal troops. There wouldn't be a bigger surrender in the U.S. Army until the Battle of the Bulge. They came non-stop in 93-degree weather, leaving dead men by the side of the road. Of the 8,000 men of this division, some 3,000 completed the march and came into action, saving the day for Robert E. Lee, stymieing the Union advance over the Burnside Bridge.
Order! On! Order! On! I want to thank you all very much. It was a great, great pleasure.
Come out here every year because I get to do a march with my friends and spend time retracing the steps of the people I read about, and it's part of our hobby.
Something drew me into the Civil War. Actually, it wasn't until later on that I discovered that I had a great-great-great-grandfather who came up from South Carolina who actually fought at this battle, which is very special. Even though he was a South Carolinian, during the A.P. Hill March and what it really meant, we did not go into battle today. We did our 15 to 17 mile march all the way from Harper's Ferry, and I'm in awe to think that the men actually didn't stop there. They actually went all the way through and had to do battle. So out of the half of the guys who survived that battle, another half would be killed later on in the battle. But it did give General Lee and the Confederacy some time to round up their troops and successfully get back into Virginia.
We marched today to honor the men of both sides that fought here at Antietam. Our Civil War was one of the things that made this nation great. It was a beacon of freedom to the rest of the world. Its after effects resonate in national life to this very day.
I've known many people to walk away from a reenactment, and they all say that this has given us a totally different outlook on the United States history. I think all of the reenactors, including myself, would like to tell the public what it was really like during the Civil War rather than Hollywood's version, the way it was portrayed from both sides. You know how Hollywood always makes the South look like the bad guys, the North as the victim. But there's a lot more to it than just that. I represent a real brigadier general that existed in the Civil War, and his name was James Henry Lane. General Lane was a professor at the Virginia Military Institute, teaching ethics and tactics. My wife, Marilyn Lane, belongs to the civilian reenactors, and she portrays my wife, Charlotte Lane, in those days. I do research on eBay, and I write directly to a lot of the museums of history in the South. I became involved in reenactments through my mailman, and it's been about 5 years. He was a lieutenant, and he delivered the mail one day and said, "Why don't you join up?" And I said, "Join up for what?" "The Confederacy." And I said, "Well, I thought the war was over with." Well, as you see, it's not.
If you're going to do reenactment, you need General Lee. I'm just trying to portray the man of the past, and I'm doing research as we go, and I'm having a lot of help from the other reenactors. Uniforms, you can buy them from the sutlers. Mine, I ordered in March. It came in Friday. Looks good to me.
Most of the costumes you see are bought by sutlers that specialize in making men's and women's clothing. Most of the women's clothing you see here are made by the women themselves after a lot of studying and research. So they're very accurate also. In the real Civil War, each side had hundreds of horse-drawn ambulances. They had no springs, had no beds or anything. They just lay the real wounded soldiers right on the flatbed of the wagon. A lot of them died because of the jerking and stuff like that.
In the 1800s, ambulance drivers were considered neutral. I like to pretend that I'm neutral and that they won't shoot at me, but even here in the reenactments, I've had people turn their guns on me after I've been picking up the other side's enemy for a while. Then they decide that there's quite enough of that, and now it's time for me to get out of there and stop rescuing people. So I'm sure that it happened just like that. Chaz rescues off-the-track standardbreds that were just too slow, and so we can put them back into harness using a new job. The horses do wonderfully on the battlefield. Getting them off the racetrack means that they're broke to crowds, they're broke to strollers and crazy umbrellas and balloons flying all over the place. So once they get to a reenactment, it's not that difficult. What I experienced today on the ambulance is probably very similar to what I would have experienced in the 1800s. The horses don't necessarily know that it is not real, so that feeling of floating down the field at a full gallop because the horses are borderline out of control, that's very typical of probably what the people back then felt.
There have been times when the audience comes up to us afterwards and asks us, "Are you firing real cannonballs?" And we say that's the whole idea, is to simulate that effect. So we do a choreography, as a cannon going off, and its result across the field.
Right before the camp opens up to spectators, all of us try to get in the atmosphere of a real camp during the Civil War. We hide everything that might look modern, and we try to portray and act like it's really happening now. Being a reenactor today has been very rewarding for me, and anybody that comes to these reenactments always generally go away with a different attitude of what it was like and how important it was. They walk away thinking, my God, this really did happen.
Bring the good old bugle, boys, we'll sing another song. Sing it with the spirit that will start the world along. Sing it as we used to sing it, 50,000 strong, while we were marching through Georgia.
Troops went through the same things that we go through. It might be wet, it might be rainy, it might even be snowing. What I portray is a newspaper artist. Now the artist sees a battle and he's got to sketch the battle. He's got to tell the story with a tool that can be done instantly. These are live action sketches actually during the battle. By doing this, every event I go to, I learn something new.
At the end of that string, there's a T-handle. You put it between these two fingers.
The United States Christian Commission was a perfect venue for me because it combined the Civil War with my faith. This was a relief organization that was geared towards the soldier, in food, in clothing, in medicines, in spiritual health. And so I come to present the spiritual and the philosophical side of the war.
And they fire the BB, and sometimes you can watch it, bear it, left, right, whatever. But with the advent of the rifle musket, accuracy went from 30% up to 80 to 90%.
To the sea, where we were marching through Georgia. Row, row, we bring the Jubilee.
Well, this is the, I think it must be the fourth or fifth year on the Common for the Civil War event, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865. And the City Hall and the local GAR Hall have been working together really, really hard to get awareness here and get more interest in the history of Lynn and the history of our nation. And if anybody hasn't been to the GAR Hall, it's a wonderful take. They've got a lot of research there. They've got over 600 portrait-style photographs on the walls of Civil War veterans from the area, and it's definitely worth the take. At the event, we've got all kinds of people. It's a demonstration event as opposed to we don't have any Confederates to fight. There's no battle activity. We have artillery here, so they're doing demonstrations periodically with firing the cannon, which you won't miss if you're anywhere within several blocks. And we've got the Salem Zouaves. They represent primarily early war unit. There were Zouaves on both sides, the north and the south, and they took their uniforms after a French unit from the Crimean War, and they have the blousey trousers and the short jackets with a lot of piping on them, so they're quite colorful. And these guys are amazing. They do a bayonet drill that's like watching a ballet, so that's definitely worth seeing. course, President Lincoln's here, and General Grant, General Robert E. Lee is here, and we've got the Naval Landing Party, we've got U.S. Navy demonstrations, so there's all kinds of stuff going on.
Well, we're here to hopefully get people's interest and to educate them on exactly what is taking place in the war. And my job is to perhaps fill them in on what's going on in the political world as well as what you see here as far as the field. But we hope to generate interest in all aspects of our current history.
So while you're feeding your face up, what other questions can we answer for you?
My name is Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant, and it is my great pleasure today to introduce to you my husband, General Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the North, although he will be very upset with me for introducing him as such. You see, a weekend like this strikes the greatest fear in his heart because he is not gifted in the ways of public speaking. But here in Lynn, we were very honored to be invited to visit with the school children over the last 2 days on Thursday and Friday here in Lynn, Mass. And they were absolutely wonderful. They asked great questions. And today on Saturday, we've been invited to be here in Lynn Common and share the life and times of the Civil War. And of course, it's an honor for General Grant to be visiting today. He was asked to speak at the ceremony here for the dedication of this beautiful bandstand. And darling, would you like to tell them anything about what you said here at the bandstand and your time in Lynn?
Well, I just thank the townsfolk of Lynn who showed up for the dedication of this fine memorial here to Frederick Douglass, or the rededication. Thank them for inviting us here and attending with me to rededicate the monument, and I thank you all very much.
I need a nurse. Woman, give me a probe.
I'm here.
Son, I can't.
No! Just secluded.
I need a probe. Oh! Oh! Hold on, son. I need to look at what's in there before we can do anything.
Give me some water.
Angles here, right here. Where his armpit starts.
Ah!
Probe.
Yes, Doc, you keep going.
You can't lose his arm. You can't lose it. You can't lose it. Get in and see what's in there. Evidently a bullet.
Generally, what we try to do is we set up stewards or hospital attendants and assistant surgeons right behind the battle line. They set up aid stations, they provide painkillers, and they try to stop the bleeding. At which point, when we're lucky enough, we get men to transport the wounded to field hospitals, which are located within a mile of the battlefront, sometimes in buildings, churches, schools, or under trees. And their primary surgeries are conducted, amputation being the most typical operation in the field hospital. The most common amputation is of the lower right hand, because that's the arm the soldiers use to load their muskets with. We have muzzle loaders, which means they load from the front part of the gun. They bring their hand up high to ram it home. When their hand is up high, they catch many balls here. There's not much we can do except to amputate below the elbow. Well, I'm a God-fearing man, and I pray every day. Without God and without my religion, I don't know if I could survive. This war has been very tough. A lot of good boys are in graves in places like Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and in Vicksburg. And that's all we have. Some doctors resort to drinking alcohol, literally taking some of their own medicine, but I'm a teetotaler. I do not take the demon rum.
Some length, and I knew there would be a lot of damage. And down, of course, down there, I'm sure there are still many of the boys are still down there, and the ambulance corps will be bringing them in. They are for hours afterwards. It takes quite a while.
How many soldiers did you see today?
I saw 4, 5 today. I lose track. The woman who helps takes care of figuring out who's there. I don't know their names or anything. We had one bullet extraction. It had gone in, glanced off the bone, and it was lodged into the armpit. And we took that out. I was able to find it. We had a shrapnel wound in a man's buttocks, for any lack of any nicer term. Evidently, he was running away from the enemy, and the general feeling in the hospital and among his guards was that he got just what he deserved. So we put him out, and I wasn't able to find any fragment. There could be something in there, though. And it is true, I'm sure you must have heard, that I do have a little bit of a problem with my whiskey. I think it is probably a reaction, perhaps, to all that goes on. Our days get very long in this profession. Sometimes we go without sleep for days at a time. And I do tend to enjoy my glass and my time off, but I swear I haven't had a drop today, and any of those men I treated who say that I was drunk while I was treating them are dead wrong, and I will take that very much to heart if I hear that.
This is one of the model cannons
cannons that was used during the Civil War. It is a full-scale 6-pound Napoleon cannon. The Napoleon cannon was used both by the Confederate States and the Union States, and it was one of the widest used cannons during the war. Some of the other cannons that you will see today are a mountain howitzer that the Confederate States are using, and they are chestnut light artillery with the Palmetto Brigade. Let me talk a little bit about this Napoleon cannon. Its range is about 13 football fields, or about 1,300 yards. If you are it shoots two types of shells out of this cannon. It shoots a spherical case shot, which is shaped very much like a torpedo shell with a powder bag in the back. And then it would also shoot a number 10 size can, or a coffee can sized of canister shot, which is a can that's filled with sawdust. And imagine 1,000 little marbles, steel marbles, being shot out. Very much like a shotgun shell, it explodes when it comes out. Very effective at close ranges at about 500 yards. It would kill a mass amount of men, or wound or maim a mass amount of men in a very close range. The spherical case shot would be used to blow up targets, buildings, corn silos, churches. It would also be used to blow up the enemy's observation points, or just to do damage, to shoot at their wagons or their caissons. In the front here, this is called the muzzle of the gun. This is where all the loading is done. Unlike today's modern artillery, which is a breech loader, the breech being here in the back, all of our loading is done here through the front. You can see that it has a 3-inch bore. That's what this hole is called, is a bore. The powder would go in first through this bore, then they would drop the shell in next. It would be pushed all the way down the tube to the back of the tube. In the very back, I don't know if you can see this, you might want to stand up a little bit to see this. There's a very small hole located here in the back of the breech. This is what they call the vent hole. This is used by the gentleman on my side that would puncture a hole in the powder bag in the back, and they'd stick an igniter, excuse my bad pronunciation this morning, but it's been a long, hard haul lately in the last couple of days. But he would stick a fuse down this hole and attach it to a lanyard. On the command of fire, he would pull the lanyard, causing it to ignite, a spark to come down there, forcing everything out of this barrel to explode. Now, some barrels are rifled and some are smoothbore. This is a smoothbore cannon. Later in the war, as the war went on, they would cause rifling. Rifling was a technique used to put small grooves on the inside of the bore, causing the ball to come out and spin as it was coming out. It was much more accurate than a smoothbore cannon is. The smoothbore cannon, the problems that they had during the war back then was that the balls or the case shot would bounce inside the tube coming out, so it might go a little bit to the left, it might go a little bit to the right, or it might be right on, depending on how it was coming out of the tube as it was coming out. This is what they call the carriage part of the cannon. Wheels are 48 inches high with an axle, and all of this is complete, good reproduction of what a cannon would look like. The manufacturer's mark in here, this is the number 25th cannon that was founded in this factory. And on the other side is the factory markings. It has an LP for LePon's tube. Further on back, we have the rest of the axle here. We have a prolong rope. The prolong rope was used to haul with horses on. It was also used to, when we had to maneuver it by hand, if we had to go down a hill or up a hill, and we did not have room for the horses, we needed to use this by hand to help us get down the hill and up the hill. We also had a hook here and the chain that would come up and fasten on here. Our implements would slide through the front. This would hold them onto the back. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a very small piece of metal down under here where the implements would rest. This here is what they call a cheek plate. This was used to keep, when we were turning, imagine this being like a big truck. When we are turning, the axle point is right here. So we did not want to turn too sharp and have the wheels go into the wood of the main body of the cannon and chew it up. So they put a cheek plate in here, which is a metal plate where the wheels would rub up against to help prevent that. Further on back here, you might want to come back here and see a little bit. This is how the cannon hooks up. There's a pintle hook underneath the limber chest. This is being the limber chest, and underneath here there's a big hook that the pintle or the lunette, this is called the lunette down here, would slide over the top of the pintle hook and you would lock it in. This would be towed as one unit. On top of here we have the limber chest. This is where they would keep the powder, all the implements, and some solid shot and case shot. There would also be two men that would ride on this, and they would be somewhat hanging on to these limber handles here as they were riding down the road. They would not be the drivers of this, but that's where two extra men would sit. Their feet would go, if you'd like to come around to the front, their feet would rest up here on these two poles, and then imagine that you would have 4 horses out in front of this cannon. 2 men on each horse, 2 men on a horse. Let me explain that a little bit better. 1 man per horse, 2 men drivers. They were called the Teamsters. You've heard of the unions today called the Teamsters Union. That's where they started to come out of the Civil War, is the word Teamsters. Also, the wagon drivers were called Teamsters. We would also have another unit very similar to this, which would have a pole, but it would have two ammunition chests on it and an extra spare wheel that would rest back here, and that would be called the caisson. Again, 2 men would ride on the ammunition chest, and again you'd have 4 horses and 2 men to run those 4-horse teams. This is what we call the fuse pouch. It is made all out of solid leather. It has one big flap that comes back and attaches to the bottom. It has a smaller flap on top in case there is an extra spark or something as an extra piece of precaution. And inside we have friction primers. Friction primer looks very similar to this. This is a friction primer. It's a modern day friction primer. It is a brass tube filled with mercury. My job as the commander is to understand and know how to make these implements and understand the science behind it. I'm a very educated man. I went to West Point, and one of the science classes I had to take was chemistry to understand how this was done. If you don't understand anything about chemistry, when you cause friction against mercury, it causes a spark. And this is what we use to ignite the cannon with. This heats up to about 1700 degrees, that little spark, to make the powder ignite. Another piece of equipment we would use is the lanyard, and on the end of it is the S-hook. The S-hook would fit into the ring of the friction primer. And on the command fire, this would be pulled, causing that spark, causing the powder bag to ignite. Some of the other tools that were used is the vent pick. It is a brass ring and a brass piece coming off of that ring. It is very dull on the bottom because you do not want to, when you stick it into the vent hole, do not want to puncture all the way to the bottom of the breech of the cannon, because that would cause pits in there, and extra powder could sit in there and you would not be able to sponge that out or cool that down. So when the gentleman was loading things through the muzzle of the cannon, they would put it back in there, and if that spark was hot enough, cause the powder to go off and blow up and kill the 2 gentlemen that would be standing in front, or it could blow up the whole cannon. Another piece that we would use is a vent brush. This is a wire brush that is used to clean out the vent hole. There's a lot of corrosion that builds up. You would dip this in water, stick it down through the vent hole, and turn it and clean to help keep some of the corrosion down. Another tool that we use is what we call a gimlet. This is like a backwards drill bit. It screws backwards in there to pull out any friction primers that might be stuck into the vent hole. The reason they get stuck is because sometimes the corrosion has built up. We have not vent brushed it properly. They would get stuck. We take this in, screw this in, and then you're able to pull out the leftover remaining tube. Another piece of equipment is the thumb stall. This would go onto their left thumb. The gentleman that would use it would stand on the left side of on the right side of the cannon, and he would stick his thumb over this vent hole. The reason that he would do that is to keep any hot air or any air from going through the vent hole during the loading process. As you know in science, that any air causes is one of the major parts of having a fire. That his job is to keep a tight, secure seal on this, so there's no hot embers that might spark up and cause the powder bag to go off, again maiming or killing the front part of the crew. The folks that work up front also wear gloves. That's an extra set of precaution for them because the implements that they're handling sometimes do get a little bit hot and do get a little bit warm. Then we have one other part of the gun. We have a gentleman that's called the powder monkey, and his job is to wear this pouch, and it would be located on his right hip, and his job is to take out of the limber chest one round and put it in this bag. This is an all-leather pouch. It's very soft on the inside, so we don't want to cause any tears in the powder. His job then is to walk it from the limber chest up to the commander. From the commander would inspect it to make sure that it has been handed as the right round and the right case shot or spherical or canister shot. Then he will pass it on, the powder monkey will pass it on to the gentleman that will stand up here. We'll go through the loading process, and then he returns back to the limber chest and waits for the next command. This is the worm. This is used to stir up any debris or pull out any debris that might be stuck into the breech of the cannon. And Private, if you'd like to go ahead, he's sticking that again. Remember, we've put this down the muzzle of the cannon. He turns it and pulls out anything that might be stuck in there. If you can see, nothing is left in there. He cannot do anything, the private cannot do anything until my thumb is on this vent hole. The reason behind that, again, is to make sure that no oxygen gets down there. His next movement, or his next implement that he picks up is the sponge, and on the opposite end of the sponge is the rammer. The rammer is a solid piece of oak used to push the charge down. He will inspect his implement to make sure that there's no rocks or stones in there. He will stick that down the muzzle of the cannon, and he will turn it 3 times one way and 3 times the next way. That's to make sure that he's put out any fires. Now, when he pulls it out, he will reverse it and put the rammer on the muzzle. The gentleman that would be standing here would hand him the charge. The charge would be dropped into the muzzle. Then he would wait for the command ram, and on that he would push it all the way down to the back of the gun. The next step, the gentleman that would be standing on this side would reach, take the vent pick, puncture that powder bag, then stick the friction primer and the lanyard in, and all of that, then the firing procedure is done outside of the wheels. The reason we do it outside of the wheels and the reason they did it outside of the wheels is because the cannon does roll forward, it does roll backwards. You don't want to run over your own men doing that. So the command then would be fire, and on fire, on ready, these gentlemen would lean away from the muzzle so they don't get any of the blast and cover one ear. The reason he looks at the muzzle of the cannon, the other gentleman that would be here would look at the muzzle of the cannon, would be to make sure it goes off. If they don't see smoke or fire or flame coming out of this cannon, they are not to advance and come in and go through the motions again. That means there's been a problem with this cannon, that the powder did not burn, it did not explode, causing the projectile to come out. It's what they called a misfire. During the war, they would pistol fire this and try to get that out as quick as possible. During our reenactments and for our safety, we wait 3 minutes because we figure that 3 minutes is the time that has elapsed long enough so if there's any smoldering embers in there that it would have caught and ignited during that period of time. Then hopefully the cannon would go off, then they would step back in. He waits for my thumb to come back on the vent hole. He rams it, he worms it again. Then he picks up the sponge, he dips it in the water bucket. The water bucket's located on the bottom down here, getting extra water on there, and pulls that in. Turns it 3 times one way, 3 times the next way, and when it comes out, you'll hear a pop. That means that this has been clear. Then he will dry sponge at one time, shaking off some extra water, sponge it to make sure that there's nothing left in there, and then we will go through the process. A good cannon crew, thank you, Private. A good cannon crew could load this in about 2 minutes. Excuse me, about 2 shots in a minute.
Sanitary Commission was formulated and put together by the ladies that felt they wanted to do something for the soldiers, their boys from home. The U.S. military only supplied so much. These were an organization that were assembled by the various women's groups, church circles, sewing circles. They wanted to send aid and raise funds for more medicines to send to their soldiers. The U.S. Sanitary Commission was approved by President Lincoln, and the Northwest Sanitary Commission was based out of Chicago. Since the Mississippi River had such a large part in transportation, many of the supplies came out of Chicago and were sent down to Cairo, Illinois. They would supply shirts, sleeping attire, night shirts, medicines, bandages, foodstuffs. These things would be sent down to supply the hospitals and the aid stations for the wounded and the soldiers' welfare. We had a battle that we saw that we needed more medicines, we needed more bandages supplied for the troops. Some of the troops needed additional foodstuffs, and these were things that we, women's groups in this area, channel in and try to get supplied so that the doctors have enough medicines and so forth. Some have had a nursing background and are sent down to nurse. Some of them are sent simply to supply the goods and find the needs, that what else that area might need. We've sent many barrels of supplies down to, well, it would have been General Grant in Vicksburg Siege to keep off scurvy. They needed fruits and sauerkraut and things like that that kept off the scurvy. We sent tons of barrels. The Chicago area Commerce Department, the merchants have been just overwhelmingly supportive.
Some of them are headed down right there.
Hard like any of them. You don't want to get killed any more than the next guy, but you're out there. You're going to try. You're not going to turn and run. The worst thing that can happen to you is you get shot in the back, so you stay there and you fight. All these people are from your own county. You know them all, and they depend on you. You depend on them. You don't run. They probably lost most of their company. Most of their company's probably gone. We caught them in the flank. And when you're caught in the flank, there's not much you can do except try to turn and meet them. If they get you first, you had it.
I'm Constance Carey. I'm a refugee lady. I had to leave my home in Alexandria at the very beginning of the war, since it's right across the river from Washington City. The Yankees occupied it in the first few days of the war. And I was then staying with my great aunts at their home in Vaucluse, their family estate. And they refused to leave to make way for the Yankees when they told the ladies they were going to take it over to make it into a Union camp of instruction. So my great aunt was carried out, still seated in her armchair between two Yankee troopers. And since then, my mother and I have lived in one room of a little hotel in Richmond. We've lived with various relatives in Richmond and elsewhere in Virginia. And most recently here out in the open, we have been living in tents for quite a while now. And it's very comfortable as long as the weather's warm. But I'm afraid we'll have to impose on some more relatives when it gets to be fall again. Well, they're basically trying to keep body and soul together. Now, the soldiers very kindly serve as protectors to us and help us out. They've helped us to procure food and so forth. And we do whatever we can in return. We'll do sewing for the boys. We'll write letters home for those who can't read and write and so forth. For the most part, though, when we're in the military camps, we are treated as guests, being ladies. I mean, there are laundresses and cooks and so forth who travel with the Army, but as ladies of good family, we are generally treated as guests. We came across here when we actually, my aunt and I made a trip up to Washington City to get some money that was on deposit for us there. We had to get passes to go through Union lines. And we're now en route back to Richmond, but decided to take it in easy stages since we don't really know where we're going to stay when we get back there.
Present. Hump. Shoulder. Hump. Support. Hump. Rest. Attention. Squat. Shoulder. Hump. Order. Hump. In place. Rest.
On April 15, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln issued a proclamation calling forth the state militias to suppress a rebellion, and men from Red Wing and the surrounding areas answered the call in droves. During the ensuing battles of the Civil War, they fought for their country with the tools of their time. Their history and sacrifice are important, and one group is helping to keep it alive. Join us as the 2nd Minnesota Battery of Light Artillery reenactors demonstrate the firing of a Model 1861 10-pounder Parrott rifle. It is a cannon just like the soldiers from our area would have fired on those battlefields long ago.
The men trained over and over and over again by detail so that every man knew what his responsibilities were to get this gun fired. On the battlefield, you'll only hear 3 commands. The gunner will say load, ready, and fire, the way it was done on the battlefield. Corporal, commence firing. Load, 1,500 yards, shell. We are members of the 2nd Minnesota Battery Light Artillery. We came here today to demonstrate firing and loading a Civil War cannon. The gun we've brought here today is our 10-pounder Parrott rifle, model 1861. 1861, the year it was invented. The tube is a cast iron tube. It has a wrought iron reinforced band across the back. That was Robert Parker Parrott's pattern. The tube weighs 900 pounds. The oak carriage that it's on is another 900 pounds. So as this gun sits here, it weighs 1,800 pounds. Using a 1-pound charge of gunpowder, it could throw a 10-pound projectile 5,000 yards, that's just about 3 miles. Its effective range, meaning I could pick the target and hit the target, was about 1.25 miles. There was a 10-man crew who operated the gun. 8 of them were in numbered positions and there were 2 unnumbered positions. Corporal, post your crew on the piece.
Post on the piece. Mark.
Take implements.
Here you go.
Each man in the gun crew has specific duties and responsibilities. I'm going to start with number 1 on the right front. Number 1, your equipment and your responsibility.
My equipment is the sponge ram, and my responsibilities would use the sponge first after the gun is fired to clean out the tube, and then once that's completed, we'll use the other end with the ram to actually insert the charge down the tube.
Number 2 is on the left front of the gun. Number 2, your equipment, your responsibility.
Okay, I'm the number 2 on this gun. Now, the implement that I'm holding is called a worm. Now, the worm was used very seldom because we had fabric bags back in those days, but occasionally it was needed to clean out the tube. Now, my second duty was to insert the powder cartridge and the projectile in the gun itself.
Number 3, your equipment and your responsibility.
My position is the number 3. I have 2 implements, a thumb stall that I will use to cover up the vent so that there's no oxygen will get in there. My other implement is the brass priming wire, which will be used to insert into the vent to make sure it is clear so that the powder from the priming will go in.
Number 4, your equipment and your responsibility.
I'm the number 4 position. I have 2 implements. One is a friction primer, which I'll insert into the vent of the gun. The second is a rope lanyard I'll attach to the friction primer. I am the trigger of the gun. When I pull the cord, the gun will fire.
Numbers 5, 6, 7, and 8 are back at the limber where the ammunition was. I'm going to start with number 5 and number 7, who had similar responsibilities. Number 5, your responsibilities and your equipment.
I am number 5, and my job is to carry the charge and projectile from the limber to the gunner, who will inspect it to make sure it's the right charge, and then I will carry it up to number 2, who will take those out of the bag and put it into the cannon, at which point I will then go back to the limber.
We use 2 positions, number 5 and number 7, doing the same job. If they wanted us to increase our rate of fire, number 5 would be walking back with an empty bag, and he would meet number 7 going forward with a full bag. Number 6, if you would explain your equipment and your responsibility.
As number 6, my job is to give the projectile and the gunpowders to number 5 and number 7. However, I'm going to be getting instructions from the gunner as to what type of projectile he wants. If it's a fused projectile, I will be cutting the fuse to the correct length using this block and I will cut the fuse to the correct length, put it into the fuse carrier on the projectile, give it to number 5 and number 7, and they will be taking it up to the gun. This is paper fuse. It's got increments in it, so you can saw it off to get the correct timing on it.
What we have displayed here are different items that come out of the limber chest on the gun. First row of items are fuses. We have 4-second, 5-second, and 8-second fuses. They were all color-coded so that there wouldn't be any mistake on the man loading it. The fuses came in packages of 5. They were inserted like this. You had to rip open a tab, pull out a fuse, and you'd have your fuse. This one would have come out of here. Okay, so that's where we're at with the fuses. Now, part of this was a friction primer. This is the package they came in, again 5 to the package, and they were pulled out as needed and given to the gunner to hand off to number 4. Or number 4 would have a series of these in his pouch already. Back over here we have the 1-pound powder charge that would have gone into the gun first to carry the round down range. If they called for a fused round, they would have to use this plug. They would have to put the fuse into a fuse cutter. That's assuming that the fuse was less than needed. This is the 5-second fuse. If we're going to cut this off, it would be sliced off with a knife and placed into the fuse plug. That plug in turn was screwed into the round. This is a shell, common shell. This would be filled with gunpowder. So that's a common shell. This is the fuse plug for an impact round. This has a musket cap on it. It's a slider. It goes inside the fuse plug, and then this cap is screwed on. Inertia, and then it's put in the shell. So when the gun goes off, inertia keeps that slider to the rear as it's flying down range, and when it hits something hard, that slider will run forward, hit the stop, set off the gunpowder, and you have your explosive charge. The next round is called case shot. This is what case shot looked like. It had a fuse plug in it. The fuse was placed thusly. There was a powder train that ran down here into an explosive charge, and when the gun went off, it would light the fuse, fly for X number of seconds, light the powder train, and this would explode in the air. The next round to be used was called a canister round. This is the canister round for a Parrott. They were made by Hotchkiss in 1862. Parrott himself did not make his own canister rounds, so they bought them from another maker. If you wanted to shoot solid shell, these were also available. These disappeared shortly after 1863. There was a note that went out eliminating the solid shot from the Parrott guns because the other artillery units all had solid shots. If they were smooth bores, they could use solid shot. But the rifles were pretty well useless. They relied more on the exploding shell. Those were the 4 basic rounds in the limber chest. In a pinch, if we could not get Parrott ammunition, Hotchkiss came out with a round for his gun. This is a 3-inch Hotchkiss bolt. It's again a solid bolt designed to do the same thing this one does. That's break things. So that was an alternative for use in the Parrott gun if we could not get ammunition when needed.
Our next position is number 8, and number 8 was a corporal.
As corporal, I'm in charge of the limber back here, overseeing the cutting of the fuse
and that proper projectiles are brought forward. I'm also in charge of making sure that this chest is full of powder and ammunition, projectiles. If there's running low, I sit there, get them from the caisson at 11 yards back to bring them forward to keep this guy full.
We have two unnumbered positions, and our first unnumbered position is one of our corporals, and he is our gunner. My job is to sight the piece and make sure that the rounds go on target. The instrument I use for that is called the stadia sight. This sight was invented at the beginning of the Civil War. It replaced the pendulum Haas. The difference between these two sights is originally the pendulum Haas has a degrees of elevation like the stadia sight does. You would aim by adjusting this up and down to whatever degree elevation you needed. It would hang off the breech of the gun like this. The gunner would look down the sight. The problem with this sight is there was no windage adjustment on it. So if the wind was blowing the round to the left or right, you would have to aim the gun a little bit further left or a little bit further right to get on target. With the invention of this sight, it fits in the back of on the breech here. Here's the front blade sight. Here's the peep sight. The gunner would look through here, across here, and at the target. Should the round go left or right, he can make a windage adjustment by loosening this thumb screw and turning this either in, out, or in. Take another shot. If it was on target, then he could just keep aiming at the piece. You wouldn't have to do any Kentucky windage. My other job also was to, once the round exploded, I could see if it was too short or too long. I could call for a fuse adjustment in seconds. Also, when number 5 and 7 bring the pouch forward, I inspect the round to make sure it's what I called for. So as a gunner, when I come to sight the piece, I will get down, I will look through the peep sight to the blade sight. I just increase the elevation to bring the sight into the picture. If I need to adjust left or right, I take my hand and I tap the trail and they move it left or right. Where it is where I want it to be, I signal that it's clear. I remove the sight and go back to firing position.
In wars prior to the Civil War, to set off a cannon, they used a flask of fine gunpowder that they would pour down the tube, vent in the tube, create a nice little pile. Then they had an implement called the flintstock. And what looks like rope here, it was called a slow fuse. It was a rope, cotton rope that had impregnated with black powder. It was lit, the black powder keep the rope burning. This way, then they had a nice ember on the end, touched it to the vent hole, and kaboom. Another way that they did it is they had a quill, a paper tube filled with fine gunpowder, and they would put the quill in, and again, the lint stock to touch it off to go boom.
The last position in the gun crew is the sergeant, who is the chief of the piece. He was responsible for the overall training of all of the men, and every man is trained in every position. So that if during a battle one man falls down, we have someone else who can step in and replace him. If we get down to the point where there is just 2 of us left, we can continue to load and fire the cannon. If one of those 2 people is to fall dead or wounded, it's the responsibility of the last man to spike the piece. And by spiking the piece, we want to make it inoperable for the enemy if it was captured. He takes a soft, square iron nail, puts it down the vent hole, and breaks it off. That way, if the gun is captured, they have no way to get fire on top of any gunpowder they might load inside.
They are computer technicians, doctors, laborers, and stay-at-home parents. But on this particular weekend, they have traded their work week titles for Civil War posts.
Oh, louder.
Hit it.
Okay, load. Vent. Vent on. Sit. Vent on. Round 4. Home. Good.
Work meetings involve cannon loading practice, and they revert back to an era when products were made by hand and baby strollers constructed out of wood. This is Civil War Camp, a live-action reenactment of the war that divided our nation in the 1860s.
We'll have 800 or 900 reenactors in the camps. We started setting up Thursday. Many of us came in yesterday. We have in-camp cars out by this morning at 8, and at 6 o'clock this morning it became a military camp. And we will live here in the camps and live in 1863 until Monday afternoon at 4:30.
Tell me a little bit of what that entails.
Because they're military camps, we're all in military units other than just the civilians. We have duties to do. The reveille starts at 6, and you're up, and the fires are going at 6, and you've got to get breakfast for the troops and for the families. There's morning parade. There's drilling on guns or on the battlefield or on the horses. At 11 o'clock, we do a battle scenario on the battlefield, and everybody has to be ready for that. Then there's hopefully get time for lunch, and then more drilling, and back to the battlefield at 3. After that, it does relax a little, but there is always closing parade, and then there's battalion commanders and higher-end officers, commissioned officers have meetings in the evening to plan the next day.
It is an enthusiastic mixture of Civil War historians and family fun.
It's a really fun, wholesome hobby. As you wander around, you'll see a lot of families. It's a wholesome hobby. It's a safe hobby. And we're all kind of part-time historians. We've learned a little bit about the Civil War, an important part of our history. And this is a great way to immerse yourself in it. That's reason 1. Reason 2, in the evenings after we're all done playing soldier all day or whatever our role is, our persona, sitting around the fire and eating some incredibly good food that's cooked outdoors on cast iron. Then the music starts and the smoke goes through the trees. It's just a cool setting. It's a cool way to camp.
You may wonder about the teenagers. Are they really into pre-technology, mid-1800 reenactments, which mean no iPods, cell phones, or gaming units?
They actually enjoy coming out here and not being able to turn them on because we don't allow them. There's a few of us that have our cell phones, but that's because we're managing the event. Other than that, you don't see them, you don't hear them, they aren't allowed. And kids do very well. You'll see them playing with toys that were made in the 1860s and having a ball, and they go back and try and tell their friends, grade school kids tell their friends what they did for the weekend. They absolutely can't comprehend it.
What do your friends think about you doing this?
Most of my friends find it cool and they want to start joining me on some of these adventures.
While the kids are playing, the grown-ups are planning battles.
The commanders of the 3 battalions, Confederate, Union, and the Artillery Battalion get together and plan the battle scenario. Sometimes they're scripted scenarios. We probably won't do any scripted this weekend that are specific battles like Pickett's Charge or some of those. We plan a scenario. We know who's going to win. But the only guys that know the scenario are the commanders.
The fun and interesting part is that nobody else down the chain of command has any idea who will win, which makes the planning and execution of battles very interesting. The crowd of spectators grows, some dressed in period scenes, to watch the battle scene like a crowd at an action-adventure movie premiere. But most would agree that this event beats 3D hands down.
Now the attention call.
There is no mistaking the call of the bugle as Union soldiers prepare to collide with Confederate troops in a bloody battlefield scene, all too familiar during the Civil War. After Confederates proved victorious in this particular battle, soldiers gather for a final parade. While today's war casualties get a walk away unscathed, 620,000 Americans killed each other in the actual Civil War. More than 3 million Americans fought, and we managed to kill off 2% of our population in just 5 years. A much less somber part of the Civil War era is the fashion, which is met with equal curiosity and interest.
Welcome to our little corner of the past. We are reenacting 1863.
Susanna hosts a fashion show during the reenactment weekend, complete with models of all shapes and backgrounds.
Length skirts, they're all down fairly close to the ground, depending if you're walking or visiting or riding in a carriage or just sitting at home in your parlor. You might have a slightly different skirt length, but for the most part they're full length. We also all have dropped shoulders. You can see here this seam. This was the look of that era. It's an off-the-shoulder seam. I have trim accentuating the broadness of my shoulders, the way shoulder pads did in the 1980s, right? You make your shoulders look bigger, it makes your waist look smaller. There's a mix of goals when you're getting dressed. When you're a woman, you want to show your wealth. If anyone's going to see you, you want to look as good as you can. You would never leave the house not looking your best. But also when you're working at home and when you're thinking about making clothes for your children, your family, you have to be really economical.
Because fabric was so scarce and many not washable, the women of that era were creative with their fashion.
And it looks like we're wearing a blouse underneath it because we have collar and cuffs poking out. But really, do you want to show them the trick? I can. Woo! It's just a little full sleeves, little undersleeve. So it's a really handy little trick. These dresses are yards and yards of fabric. And silk and wool can't really be washed. And so one way to protect our clothing, very important and fashionable, is by wearing a collar and cuffs or undersleeves, depending on your sleeve, because these are white cotton. These can be washed in hot, hot water.
Handing down and altering outfits was common, also involving some creative methods.
So we have two little girls here in dresses. One's a little older than the other, and one has a slightly longer skirt, but they have simple dresses on. Again, short sleeves and open necklines are fine for kids and are easy for mom. The sleeves aren't dragging through anything. And when it's summer, we want them to play.
And for the young ladies?
We've got fitted waists, full hoop skirts, corsets, high necklines for the most part. We'll talk about some options for younger ladies too. Young women were expected to dress very proper and look very nice as soon as they were of marriageable age and had finishing school or whatever they were attending to prepare them for marriage.
There were also working girl outfits with aprons, and for the gentlemen, vests and coats were used to cover the first layer, which was considered underwear, unacceptable to be on display. The authenticity of period dress is extremely important.
Your dress is beautiful. Tell me about how you got that.
Well, we went to Gettysburg last summer, and I had been saving up my money to get a dress. And so we walked into one of the dress shops down in Gettysburg, and they picked out a few dresses, and they chose the best one that they thought would go for me. And then they took me back into the dressing room, showed me how to use all the tools and different things to put on it, and then they let me try it on. And so then from there, I got to choose whether I wanted it or not, and I did. And they picked out a hat for me.
It's great to see the changes that have happened as this group has gotten bigger over the past 15 or 20 years. It's gotten a lot bigger. We have a lot more people. We have a lot more women and children. It used to be a lot about the men fighting, and it still is, but now we have a lot of women showing how families might have looked too, and that's a really important part of Civil War education, at least for me. I'm not so interested in the battles, but it's about the culture of people, and obviously fashion is associated with that.
The fashion show and other educational period demonstrations prove that these reenactments are about much more than a bunch of grown men playing war.
Well, we do a lot of education pieces where we go into the middle schools and do presentations on a regular basis to really educate the kids on what really happened at that time. The education programs oftentimes can only cover the surface material of it, for when we are able to kind of bring it to life for them, and then it actually makes more of an impact.
Aside from the school demonstrations and battles, the camp, with its lack of modern conveniences, really sends the reenactors back in time.
I've actually woken up in camp and got up in the morning and went, wow, I just went back in time, because there's not a modern convenience in here.
In the Civil War at the Battle of Gettysburg, he was in the front line, and he got up almost to the wall, about 30 feet from his wounded. He rolled back down the hill and lay in a sinkhole while the battle went on. His comrades and people that he knew that was in his company went over the top of the rock wall of Little Round Top, and when the flag bearer was on the wall, he turned around and motioned, "Come on." And a few minutes after that, he went over the wall. The battle died there, and Mr. Greer knew that they were killed or captured. Many years afterwards, he went back to a reunion there, and he walked his way through the valley of wheat and so on like that at that time, and got to the wall, where he thought Hicks went over the wall. And he went over the wall, went about 30 feet from it, and there was a little monument. On that monument it stated that there was a high tide of the Confederate Guard for the day, and the flag bearer and its captain both were killed at this spot.
We're drinking tonight on the old red ground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, a song of home and friend we love to hear. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to end. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the door.
Veterans of the blue and the gray of the United States, I accept this monument in the spirit of brotherhood and peace.
Well, that's the end of it. Anywho. Well, it's getting late. Good.